Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our forum, Reimagining Our Practices and Pedagogies, Sustainability Science in Authoritarian Times. You might be familiar with or have already heard about our Pathways Forums. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, the Pathways Forum is an open webinar series that aims to open up discussion and a space for reflection and mutual learning on a variety of sustainability topics, concepts, methods, and different cases. And from our last webinar that we've organized in October, the forums are now inscribed in a larger project that is the Pathways Deep Dive, a project that we've been working on since last year. And just to give you some context about the Pathways Deep Dive, this new project has the objective of raising awareness about the connections between ecological crisis and socio and geopolitical tension that we are currently observing around the world. And our aim is really to foster and create a better understanding of how authoritarian and far-right movements strategize to obstruct climate action and also discredit sustainability science. But at the same time, we also want to explore forms of resistance and responses that have taken shape against these dynamics. And we do so through various activities. We kickstarted this project through our conference that we organized in France last June, and also webinars such as this one. We also wrote blogs, we created a survey and a podcast as of our latest project, and as well as a board game. And the deep dive, as spaced, as you can guess, from the broad topic between different issues, from far-right communication to environmental disinformation. But today we will be focusing more broadly on how sustainability research and education adapt within complex political landscapes that devalue or even actively undermine transformative agendas. And so to navigate the many facets of today's forum, we're very glad to be joined by our speakers, Viola Hakkarainen from Leuphana University of Lunenburg, Wesley Maraire from the University of Bergen in Norway, and Jonas Torrens from Utrecht University. We will first kickstart the discussion with Viola's presentation, who will explore the tensions that sustainability researchers and educators face when engaging with real-world societal change and present the principles that catalyze the inner-outer transformations that we need. And then we will follow listening to Wesley on the language of transformation and how agendas are risk to be co-opted within academic institutions. And lastly, Jonas will present a recent initiative called Impossible Projects. And it was a collaboration with the KIN, the Dutch Transformative Climate Research Program, to spotlight research that is often overlooked by traditional funding. And to explain you a little bit how it will work, the first part of this webinar is dedicated to the presentation of our speakers. And after each presentation, which will last about 15 minutes, we will have 5 minutes for clarifying questions. So really related to a specific concept or a specific understanding, but please leave the more conceptual questions for the second part of the webinar, which will be a discussion space for you to ask more substantial, complex questions and also express your thoughts and remarks. And the second part of the webinar will be facilitated by Bruno Locatelli, who's an environmental scientist in the Forests and Societies Division at CIRAD, at the University of Montpellier. And Bruno is also one of the scientific advisors to the Pathways Deep Dive project, and he helped us greatly in developing it. And all right, so now I would suggest I will stop sharing my screen and I will leave the floor to Viola to kickstart our presentation part of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Viola. And I will just find my screen and start to share it. So I believe it should be working now quite okay. Excellent.
Yes.
Amazing.
Perfect.
Okay, hello everyone. And first, thank you very much for the invitation to speak in this webinar that indeed targets one of the key questions I have been hearing within the sustainability science community, but also, of course, been thinking in my own work. My name is Viola Hakkarainen. I am calling in from Leuphana University of Lüneburg in Germany, and I was asked to kind of frame this talk through two recent perspective or overview pieces that I was part of writing, and I will explore the tensions in sustainability science when we commit to action, and especially during these uncertain and authoritarian times we are living now. Well, there has been this question popping up recently quite a lot. What is the role of sustainability science and education during these times? And I just wanted to start with my key message and also my perspective on this, that the role is to commit to creating and sustaining spaces for diverse narratives and alternative visions that we can ensure that sustainable, just and equitable futures are not marginalized or excluded during these times. So kind of we play a bigger role than ever before, in my opinion, during these uncertain times. This is a very brief talk, so first I walk pieces first around the tensions and then the big question of committing to transformations and how. And I will then finish with the one slide about kind reminders, how to find a meaning during these times we are living in. So the scene, we all are maybe familiar, and we have ended up to this webinar to discuss this. So we have dark clouds above us, I would say. So we have the escalating, intertwined environmental and social economic crises, the polycrisis situation combined with the geopolitical tensions, authoritarian times, democratic backlighting, polarizations, combined with many interlinked phenomena, anti-intellectualism, declining trust in expertise, the spread of regressive policies, far-right agendas, conservative values. And at the same time, if we land then to our academic systems and universities, we still have systems that we are working in systems that are not diverse, not equal, and there are huge gaps between the stated sustainability goals on paper and universities. And yes, we work in operate through neoliberal market-driven logics instead of maybe committing to truly transformative deep transformations and actions. And then there is us, the sustainability science or research community that also is incredibly diverse. And we also hold diverse and conflicting approaches to transformations and to sustainability, starting from the definitions and, of course, then going all the way to the question, well, how to transform and how sustainability should be implemented in society. This is, of course, a bit simplified picture of very complex landscape, geopolitical situations and diverse contexts we are in, but maybe this is just capturing few of the clouds and trends and issues we are experiencing in different places. So I was asked to talk about this paper, Entanglements of Knowledge and Action in Sustainability Science, Reclaiming Reflexivity to Embrace the Uncomfortable. And me and my co-author Anita Lasurgo, we finished this paper asking the question, how does this context that I just presented in the previous slide reshape the kinds of transformations we can realistically expect from institutions and individuals and the courage required to pursue them? Or does it instead make such transformations all the more urgent? So I'm sure that we all are asking many questions of ourselves. Yes, how do we act? How do we commit to action in such times? This paper, before I delve into what we actually said. I just want to highlight that we were inspired by this concept of double reality introduced by Thierry et al. In 2023 in the paper No Research on a Dead Planet, where they described the situation where many researchers produce evidence about the crises and the transformative changes that are needed, but also stay at the same time from action in their institutions and everyday lives. So we wanted to take this concept to the community of sustainability science and scientists, because it's kind of really special field, as you know. So sustainability science from fundamentals is committed to action. So we are here not to just to describe problems, but we are also trying to think about solutions, produce actionable knowledge, so forth. We are thinking about what is the better way of live on the earth and how to achieve it. And we are deeply part of the systems we are studying, and therefore it's been suggested widely in the sustainability science literature that we can frame and should frame all the research as interventions. So whatever we do is anyway intervening the world. And we also go on suggesting then that knowledge is actually action from the beginning. However, when we take this commitment to actions, and we are also thinking through this double reality, so like producing evidence, we should change, we should act, there is something that Anita and I describe in this paper as an uncomfortable space. So rather than living in the gap of double reality, we are actually in this situation that we can experience multiple tensions when we start to actually commit to action in sustainability science. And where I think these tensions have been there since the beginning, I would say that these are becoming more and more urgent the more we see the far-right agendas taking place, the war narrative spreading in the world. But basically, we then outline that this uncomfortable space consists of the fact that sustainability science is fundamentally normative. It's value-laden. I would argue any research is value-laden, but especially when we talk about what is the desirable futures, we have to face the normative questions and the subjectivities of ourselves in relation to others and our institutions, which can cause discomfort. Then, of course, sustainability science need to engage, or we have to engage with the plural values, worldviews, knowledges out there, and we can see that it can be easy to get kind of lost in this pluralism when we start to be aware that every choice, every action, every recommendation we make is situated in this plural landscape, which means that there are always going to be trade-offs. The question of inclusion and exclusion is going to be there. Maybe no action is perfect, but somehow we have this commitment to action and intention to move forward. And finally, not separately, but overlappingly, we also observe the discomfort and tension arising from the active engagement with power and politics. So not to have just power and politics as research questions, but actually, if we talk about action and transformations, we have to engage with these fields. And of course, this requires courage because yes, we're starting from, okay, if we have a more active voice in society, can it lead to targeting the individual researchers and so on and so forth? So how do we then deal with the power-laden political situations where our work actually is situated and targets to change often? I'm not aware of them. I hope someone stops me if I'm talking too much. But anyway, so we also make the point that, okay, we have to navigate this uncomfortable space. It's there, it's shared between researchers coming from different sustainable. And we propose that the idea of reclaiming reflexivity so that we can actually, in a way that we actually target the action-oriented and political dimensions of our work, not only reflecting of the knowledge production part, but also the action and how we engage with these dimensions. But because research is anyway an intervention, we also have the freedom and responsibility then choose how we engage with the real world, right? So if we cannot avoid action, we are doing it anyways. And there we see a rise of opportunity to work towards, say, changes, transformations in different ways that can take different forms depending on who is doing and doing what. But highlighting again that acting on this agency requires courage and support from institutions and communities. And for example, it's very worrying to see if researchers engage in activism if they are threatened by their universities, by funding loss, or even getting fired. So, of course, to be able to act and speak out requires strong institutional support for the individuals. And then, as said already, because we are sharing this uncomfortable space as researchers in sustainability science, we have to support each other there and kind of get united over the shared intentions. Now I will move forward because I have a few more slides and I know that the clock is ticking. Won't go deep enough with this big question of transformations and how. That's kind of the biggest question, right? How do we transform? I just share a few ideas linking then to the more pedagogical and educational side that we have been thinking of with some colleagues. So we have been using Christine Wamsler's and colleagues' idea of the internal and external or inner-outer transformations. In their work, they pose some transformative qualities and capacities that could enable this bridging inner and outer transformations. And they talk about awareness, insight, connections, and purpose and agency. But then the question that we explored in this other piece with my colleagues was that how do we operationalize these principles in our pedagogical and educational practice? And we then landed on this non-exhaustive list of different principles to work with this inner-outer transformations model as sustainability scientists who also teach a lot, so also educators. And also in this paper, we provide different strategies, pedagogical approaches and tools to address each principle. But here I want to highlight the way forward as we see it is basically acknowledging diverse and dynamic positionalities of learners and teachers, foster compassionate approaches, ground educational experience in place, acknowledge progressive contextualization and temporality, emphasize process and emergence rather than outcome, foster practice-oriented engagement for building self-efficacy and collective action, and then again address power, politics, and structures. So we really cannot shy away from these difficult questions of what is going on regarding those dimensions. I know this is rather a quick overview. I'm happy to engage in more discussion over these topics, but basically how would I summarize this both? So how it is the tensions to work, how to move forward with the tensions, working as a sustainability science and having this action-oriented idea, and as well working as an educator, trying to catalyze transformative learning and enable then that students become critical, reflexive people who can also take action in society. I would like to finish with very simple, kind reminder: where can we all find meaning in authoritarian times? I would say we really need to provide the alternative narrative that is around collaboration, collective thinking and action and care, instead of the values that we see currently in the world more broadly. So I believe that the commitment to these values and approaches will be the core for our sustainability research community in the future. And I will finish here, but as said, really excited to hear different experiences from all around the world. And again, saying that I am not working in the context such as, for example, in the US right now, where universities are actively targeted and researchers being silenced. So happy to then engage in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Viola, for your presentation. It was very, very interesting. I would ask participants if they have a few quick clarifying questions that we can take right away. If there's anything that was unclear and you would like Viola to clarify now, feel free to just raise your hand or write them in the chat. Seems like it was very clear, and it was indeed. In any case, you'll be able to ask questions later on as well. So now perhaps we can then switch to Wesley's presentation.
Thank you. That one is sharing.
Yes, perfect.
Brilliant. Okay. So, and then of course it started at the end, coming back. So yeah, my name is Wesley Maraire. I'm at the University of Bergen on a project called Habitable Air, Urban Inequality in the Time of Climate Change. However, this is sort of my last week. I will be moving to the University of Copenhagen on a Marie Curie fellowship on a project that will be looking at carbon capture and storage within sort of the North Sea. And so I speak as a Zimbabwean who has moved to Europe. And so I am both sort of an outsider and an insider. So I preface this in positionality so that perhaps some of the things I say will make sense in that sort of context. Now, my contribution focuses on, I should put a timer for myself before we do this. Okay. My contribution focuses on a challenge that is less dramatic than overt political suppression, and yet just as consequential for sustainability science. That is, how the language of transformation, terms like sustainability, justice, decolonization, gets systematically hijacked inside our own institution. This is a form of resistance that does not look like censorship, or persecution for that matter. My slides are not moving. And so having said that, it looks like support for the most part. It also sounds like alignment when you don't interrogate it. It appears in strategy documents, diversity frameworks, reconciliation plans, and sustainability roadmaps. However, structurally, it works to stabilize the very arrangements of power that these agendas claim to transform. Now, I will frame this in 3 parts. And the first one is effectively attempting to name the problem. Across universities in Europe, North America, more broadly settler colonial states, or the imperial core, if you may, there has been a proliferation of decolonization rhetoric, climate justice rhetoric, and transformation rhetoric. Scholars such as Bambra et al. Document in their 2018 book, How Higher Education Has Enthusiastically Embraced Decolonize the Curriculum, in air quotes, agendas, while Stein, in the same year, shows us how the language of transformation circulates particularly strongly in sustainability education. But despite this uptake, imperial epistemic, structural, and material hierarchies remain almost entirely intact. This is a paradox. This is a paradox that you will see throughout the presentation, but also when you start interrogating your own institutions. I found that the more fluent institutions become in articulating transformation, the less likely they are to enact the structural changes those concepts require. In my own work, I call this process systemic hijacking. It is a structural description, not a moral indictment. It prescribes the causal mechanisms through which institutions absorb critique in ways that stabilize existing power arrangements. This systemic hijacking operates through three main interlinked mechanisms. It is functional misrecognition, which is the first one I'll tackle. And I describe this as the widespread misapplication of decolonization inside imperial formations. Following Tuck and Young, decolonization is a project centered on land, sovereignty, and material restitution. But when imperial institutions deploy this framework upon themselves, they commit a category error. The institution genuinely believes it is reforming, but structurally, it substitutes decolonization for what Chern calls de-imperialization in his 2010 book, which is the inward-facing dismantling of imperial infrastructures of governance, knowledge, and accumulation. The second is counter-performativity. I build on Ahmed's analysis of non-performativity. Counter-performativity describes institutional speech and action that not only fails to achieve its stated goals, but produces outcomes opposite to them. A university, for example, launches a decolonization committee. The committee generates reports, recommendations, and training workshops. However, the material foundations of the institution, its endowments, land, partnerships, governance, they all remain effectively the same. They are unchanged. And the visibility of the committee strengthens the institution's reputation as progressive. I note, though, that, and perhaps you follow me on this, that counter-performativity is in fact not failure. It is actually success just in the opposite direction. The third mechanism is institutional selection pressures. The universities exist within competitive ecosystems. You have rankings, donors, accreditation regimes, and political expectations. These pressures reward symbolic activity, statements, workshops, inclusion initiatives, and penalize activities that threaten material assets or authority structures. Thus, sustainability scientists and educators often find that the more our work implies redistribution, relinquishment, and structural change, the more our institutions respond through symbolic activity instead. Together, these three mechanisms I outline constitute what I am referring to as systemic hijacking. They are not the work of bad people. I actually don't think that the individuals in these offices are in fact bad people, but I think they are the work of systems selecting for survival, because they also know that the real work that doesn't metaphorize decolonization could effectively end the institution as we know it. Now, moving on to part 2, I want to connect to the theme sustainability science in authoritarian times. The webinar frames our discussion around authoritarian times, contexts where academic freedom is openly suppressed, governments police knowledge, and dissent is criminalized. These dynamics are definitely real, and I want to extend them rather than dispute that framework. And Viola has already spoken about the inner-outer tensions sustainability educators face when engaging with societal change. I want to suggest that systemic hijacking is precisely what undermines the outer register of that transformation. The institutional, structural side, even where the inner commitment is genuine. I don't want to preempt Jonas's intervention, but his Impossible Projects initiative spotlights research overlooked by traditional funding, which represents exactly the kind of counter-coordination I will come to at the end of this talk. But first, we need to recognize that authoritarian times is not only an external threat. Scholars such as Gilroy remind us that democracies can also be structured by what he calls post-colonial melancholia. And that's the refusal to reckon with imperial foundations and contemporary complexities. Meanwhile, Bambra shows that European states often frame their colonial past as something external to themselves, which enables forms of global governance and funding that produce hierarchy under the banner of benevolence. In this sense, sustainability science faces external authoritarian pressures, but also internal structural pressures within democratic institutions where policy commitments depend more on donor alignment than democratic participation, where research agendas are shaped by competitive funding and not communal priorities, where the language of transformation becomes a reputational asset and not a structural problem. If we only recognize authoritarianism where it is very overt, in your face, we risk missing the quieter, bureaucratic, and competitive practices that also silence, steer, and neutralize transformative work. The challenge for sustainability science is therefore twofold, in my opinion. Resisting overt political repressions and resisting internalized institutional hijacking that occurs even sometimes, and especially so, where we claim to be very democratic. I will move on to these three structural levers. I now want to turn to resistance. I'm not offering a blueprint. By no means am I saying this is a silver bullet, but I want to carry on from where Viola left off and saying, let's not be prophets of doom, and let's find some hope within this. What I do offer, though, are structural levers and conditions under which hijacking becomes difficult to sustain. The first lever is tethering symbols to material structures. Symbolic actions become transformative when they carry material implications. I'll give you an example of the Roads Must Fall activists. As Gabriel documents, and Francis Ngamdor does the same in Cape Town, it shifted the debate from the statue to the Rhodes Trust endowment. And this exposed the material underpinnings of that symbol. So it went beyond just the statue itself. And they started asking questions about the Rhodes Trust endowment and how that has sort of perpetuated the neo-colonial project. In sustainability science, this means linking climate justice rhetoric to funding sources in investment portfolios. It means tying SDG commitments to procurement and partnership decisions, tying the land acknowledgements to actual land relationships. I think we can learn a lot from our friends in Australia on how to do and not to do this. The symbol is not the problem itself, at least for me. The problem is the symbol floating free of its material base. The second lever is preventing the lateral displacement of critique. Hijacking works because institutions can redirect a demand from one domain to another. A material demand becomes a symbolic concession. An epistemic demand becomes a procedural committee. This can be resisted by forcing what I call convergence. And by this, I mean aligning symbolic, epistemic, and material demands to the institution, which cannot isolate each one. In so doing, preventing the institution from isolating each one of these. For sustainability science, convergence can look like designing community partnerships where funding, governance, and epistemic authority all shift together. Doing so then means we're creating evaluation frameworks that require epistemic justice and material redistribution, and therefore refusing to allow climate justice to be reduced to diversity rhetoric. The third lever is counter-coordination through external networks. Institutions change when the cost of not changing far exceeds the cost of conceding. One way this happens is through external pressure from networks that create alternative prestige circuits, challenging the authority of imperial evaluation systems. Examples include the Africa Charter for Transformative Research Collaborations, or the CLASCO in Latin America, and Indigenous Studies departments gaining autonomous validation capacity. Sustainability scientists can support similar counter-coordination by building networks with Indigenous, community-based, and Global South scholars, for want of a better word, that set their own evaluative criteria, refusing ranking based collaboration models, designing participatory projects that share authorship, data ownership, and governance. This is also what I would suggest what makes initiatives like Jonas's Impossible projects politically significant beyond their immediate reach. They're a node in an alternative prestige circuit, not a supplement to the existing one. Authoritarian times, as I close, are not only external political threats. I believe they also take the form of internal institutional dynamics that sideline transformative work while appearing to support it. For me, systemic hijacking is the structural mechanism through which this happens, and it also operates most effectively inside institutions that have already learned the language of transformation, which is to say, most of our institutions here. The antidote, though, is not better language. No, I don't accept that. I think it is structural tethering, convergent demands, and counter-coordinated networks that redistribute epistemic authority and material power simultaneously. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wesley, for your presentation. Is there anyone that has a clarifying question to ask now, whether in the chat or you can raise your hand and take the floor if you prefer. If not, maybe we go straight into the last presentation with Jonas, and then we will have time later on for discussions, if that's okay. So yes. Jonas, I will leave the floor to you now.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Wesley, also for bringing in a kind of zoomed out and very relevant perspective that also, I think, helps contextualize what I'm going to do. You will notice that there's going to be a slight shift in the emphasis and shift perhaps in the tone, as the project that I was working with was one where we're very much emphasizing the sort of effort to open up. Sorry, let me just try to share appropriately first. I hope you can all see this screen.
Yes.
Continue to share. Yes. I would just minimize your side screen. Can you see also the Zoom window on top of the PowerPoint or not?
No, we just see okay. Your slide.
Perfect. Yes. So part of our effort was one of disclosing different possibilities for the funding system, and therefore our presentation has a kind of optimistic and upbeat tone that might contrast somewhat with what we've been discussing. And that actually reflects the tone that the meetings took on their own. So it's not necessarily something that we imposed, but it's actually something that we picked up as a result of this collaboration. I was working very closely with KIN, which is an initiative within the NVO, the Dutch funding agency, basically for scientific research, which is exploring new ways of funding transformative climate research. They have a whole range of experiments. And I was working very closely with them and Foundation We Are, which is a social design foundation based in Eindhoven, who is exploring also the role of design in thinking about new forms of collaboration, working very closely with scientists, but in a variety of formats as well. Interestingly, KIN was doing its own exploration and trying to find participants or experts that were pointing towards novel ways of approaching funding, and they basically matchmake and put us together in a collaboration, and it was a very fruitful collaboration that came up from that. Alex, Cornelia from Foundation We Are, myself, Matthijs from Erasmus University of Rotterdam, and Stephanie, which was herself from KIN. And we were tasked with exploring new approaches to funding. And this is something that connects very much with my background in that I've been studying sustainability related questions for the longest time and have been dedicating my effort in thinking about new practices and approaches that actually increase our capacity to relate to the problems that we have. And this has taken a variety of shapes, be it new approaches to transformative innovation policy that are attempting to change how innovation itself is organized, all the way down to urban practices of experimentation. And lately I find myself working closely with funders because I see the ways in which funding is then structuring a whole approach in academia that trickles down and becomes a kind of self-reproducing in a way. So our collaboration was recognizing the ways in which we are ourselves and a lot of our colleagues embedded in settings that are highly projectified, highly competitive, where the very imagination of what is possible research-wise is constricted by like very fast-changing constraints, expectations, and requirements of the funding system. I find myself often in conversations with colleagues struck by the ways in which our imagination has become so confined by those requirements. It's almost as if we're only allowed to imagine a possibility for research once a call has been announced. And in many ways, we are hearing discussions, especially in the Netherlands, where I'm based, around the notion of transformative research as a potentiality, a space of exploration. And this is very much in the agenda of KIN, but there are increasing questions about how specifically, what does it mean? What forms of research does it even imply? And also, to what extent is this actually changing our epistemic practices or not? And in this space, we see that research calls are actually determining oftentimes what outcomes are even pursuable. And in doing that, also structuring careers, research lines, the infrastructure that gets constructed. And this funding landscape is one that has been shaped over many, many years, and it's never been designed for this particular purpose. It is much more of a layering of these range of different practices that have evolved over time. And early on in our collaboration, it became very clear that funders don't know what they don't know, in that they only see projects that fit the constraints that they impose on themselves. So there is a circular process by which funding constraints configure research, and that then goes on to funding, to informing the next constraints and so forth. With that in mind, our research and our collaboration was attempting to explore what are those forms of research that fall outside the current purview of funders, and in doing that, highlighting what are some of these possibilities that we're kind of simply missing out in that. We were trying as much as possible to stay close to the lived experience of researchers rather than using, let's say, the literature in order to define what those research priorities would be. And we were really seeking also the energy and the vectors of change. And this is part of a language that we had to develop ourselves in order to articulate the kind of change that we were recognizing. What we mean here is that, in effect, there are topics, formats, ways of doing research that are truly enlivening and motivating, and that provide researchers with a lot more resources in and of themselves. And there is also a whole range of different vectors or directions in which we could be changing the funding system. Everything from rethinking, for instance, the collaborations with countries in the Global South, or finding new approaches to fund non-scientific participants, to modes of science with citizens and citizen science, for instance, that could be potential directions in which funding could evolve. So rather than prescribing that multiplicity, we were interested in finding what the research community in the field had to say about that. And we were approaching this through a design-led approach via continuous reflection with this small group that was working in a relatively small project as well for about a year. And we emphasized from the beginning co-creation and a bottom-up process rather than, again, a series of experts deciding what those directions would be. And throughout this collaboration, we were trying to embody this attitude of how could we make this possible rather than assuming that something is truly impossible in its own right. We structured this in several stages. We began with interviews, organized an open call with a very alternative evaluation process, develop a series of podcasts as a way of dissecting that data already in a public space, and organize the co-design session. And I'll unpack this very quickly. The interviews were covering two kinds of stakeholders. It was a small number of interviews that were primarily about sensitizing our team to what was at stake. You can see here some of the themes that were emerging. Of course, this being a design-led process, we used Miro, as you could imagine. But those interviews were effectively sensitizing us to some of those topics I mentioned. And they were covering both mavericks that have stayed outside, if you want, the funding system and have managed to find the cracks and the nooks and crannies of the funding system to make their careers work, as well as if you want, elders of the funding system that had seen it evolve over time and they had a good structural overview. We then organized a call for ideas, and we set it up in a way that had the lowest possible barrier to entry. The idea here was that we were literally calling for impossible projects. We were saying, show us your promising ideas that are currently impossible to be funded. And what that did was that it shifted the conversation from like traditional conversations around what is viable or what is acceptable in disciplinary terms towards a question of what is necessary, what is most significant, what we cannot do without. And these ideas were then evaluated. So we received 37 submissions, and these were literally 3-minute audio submissions that were meant to be as low as possible barrier to entry. Those unfundable gems, and we talk about unfundable gems to highlight their preciousness, the fact that they are not to be taken for granted. We were looking at, to what extent they were well articulated, well thought through, the upside and the ways in which they were uninterestingly unfundable. Not just something that is extremely expensive, but something that perhaps fall outside of the constraints of what funding is currently able to do. We shortlisted 12, and we had an evaluation with the whole team to select the 5 gems that covered a broad range of constraints. And the participants received a €500 development fund in order to be able to develop this further, specifically identifying some of the rough edges of their ideas that cause friction with existing funding systems. And this led us to record podcasts with the audios that were submitted, with the authorization, of course, of those participants. I encourage everyone to check this podcast list, which is truly delightful, I think, as a read, and also thought-provoking. And finally, we organized the co-creation, co-design session in which we created these templates where participants themselves, guests that they had invited, and funders from a whole range of funding agencies were coming together to design the kind of instruments that would make those impossible ideas possible. And what that did was to kind of highlight to us, first of all, the constraints that were making them impossible, and alternatively, the possibilities that were hidden there. So just in terms of the prototypes that were generated in the session, we discussed things like person-based fellowships for transition pioneers, process-based funding for collective learning, practice-based networking and building grants, and lean open calls with lottery selection and so forth. So you can see a kind of whole range of prototypes. We're not trying to find the perfect prototype, but rather create a kind of range of ideas that show to Kin just what else is possible. Critically, the workshop was also prompting a discussion about this difference between thinking in terms of a flag, where there is a kind of clear aim to the call, but the exclusions themselves are loose, and there is a sense of a clear directionality and less emphasis on the proceduralism of a lot of the calls, instead of the conventional boundary thinking that a lot of calls fall, where there is a kind of predictability in what the proposals generate. In general, the participants were extremely enlivened and sort of felt empowered as a result of this workshop. And many of them described, for instance, that it opened up a whole new world where they were inverting and truly allowing themselves to imagine, first of all, what would be necessary and most meaningful, rather than begin from the funding constraints. And the method that we develop is also surfacing tacit assumptions that then the funders can work on and recognize and shape around what counts as legitimate research, for instance. So what did we find? First of all, we found ample evidence of the narrow definitions of what counts as research and qualifies as researcher, many of which are actually inherited from entirely other regulations that have nothing to do with the policies that the funders themselves are trying to do. For instance, the European state aid regulation forces NVO to largely fund traditionally scientific organizations, even though NVO has an interest in expanding beyond those seats to think of other forms of research. Of course, the prioritization of academic outputs over translation, dissemination, and impact work was common across the board. But also, many situations had these overlapping structural constraints. I mentioned the state aid, but also the various different temporalities, where there was an assumed logic that a project should be about 2 to 3 years, or that an infrastructure that took 10 years to build was simply unfeasible. It was also very clear that a lot of the procedural constraints are effectively downplaying, downgrading, devaluing various forms of impact, such as emotional, systemic, or relational impact, that are simply harder to measure. And also in doing so, discouraging entire swathes of methods that are perhaps more speculative or unusual collaborations that simply don't fit existing norms. And finally, it was also very clear that even though there is an attempt to create diverse committees to investigate, to evaluate calls, that those committees still impose these paradigmatic constraints that render the colonial critical, or not read the last one, but yeah, power redistributing research makes them unfundable. This is very much reported by a range of the participants involved. This was a picture from our final workshop. You can see the team that came together, and it was interesting that many of them reported for the first time being enlivened and delighted and considered, sort of feeling seen and respected by the funding agencies for the first time. And this meant that we were shifting towards really seeing each other, opening up to the assumptions to be investigated, and a different way of bridging between disciplines, where there was a conversation about what was truly necessary rather than starting from the knowledge there. And this is now leading to new alliances and trust and a sense of inspiration and motivation that is rare for the funding system. We are currently in the process of continuing that work in terms of strengthening the kind of capacities of kin to be able to do this kind of work more regularly, and also exploring ways to embed and implement these at different scales. I'm very honored to be here, and I would look forward to the questions. Just to finalize, this quote from Tanner, who's in our final report, was really struck with me, that there is a critical mass of people who have their hearts and soul in the work that collectively can make a society a better place, and yet we find ourselves oftentimes unable to fund and to really tease out that work. So we need more approaches that can make that evident and bring that front and center. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonas. I would suggest to quickly take the clarifying questions for Jonas now, and then we can move on to our discussion part, if there are any clarifying questions. Doesn't seem like it, and if there are any, we can pick them in the discussion part. I think that should be okay. So now, Bruno, I would leave the floor to you to moderate the rest of this discussion part.
Thank you so much, Viola, and thank you very much to the three speakers for their very, very interesting presentations. My name is Bruno Locatelli. I'm going to facilitate this discussion. We have 1 hour, and we'll have time to open the discussion with the participants. And I'm going to start with providing a very brief summary of what we have heard in the three presentations. So we have been lucky to listen to very interesting presentation with different perspectives on the topic of the webinar today. This webinar was about reimagining our practices and pedagogies, sustainability science in authoritarian times. With this webinar, we wanted to provide a space to discuss how sustainability research and education can adapt to and transform within complex political landscapes characterized by socio-geopolitical tensions. So during the webinar, we have moved from the internal work of personal and pedagogical transformation with Viola, and through the linguistic and institutional battleground where our languages and agendas are co-opted with Wesley, and to the transformation of funding system mindset through the impossible projects that bypass traditional and restrictive processes with Jonas. So we have heard those different perspectives, and now we have time to have an overall discussion on the topics that we have discovered. And I was really interested in the fact that in all the presentations, the speakers have provided different angles on the topic of the webinar, but also provided insight into the necessity of reclaiming agency. And the speakers have provided ideas to act. For instance, Viola talked about the commitment to action, how to commit to transformation. She talked about the inner-outer transformation. Wesley presented the three structural levers to address systemic hijacking. And Jonas explained how we can embody the question of how to make it possible, and also to shift how people consider funding in the academic system. So I was really interested in all those examples of possible actions. So I would like to discuss this a little bit more because we had little time during the presentations. So I would like to ask first to the speakers, in their experience, what are the most effective strategies for a scientist to reclaim agency or to resist or to refuse to give in? Is it in the personal inner transformation, the language we choose, or the way we structure our project or look for funding? This question is important because in the series of webinars that we call the deep dive, we try to discuss how sustainability scientists can resist or cope with the political pressures that are trying to silence their voices. So I would be very interested in listening to your thoughts about agency and action. Who wants to start?
I'm happy to start just to get a ball moving, because I think your question prompted it. Just this morning, I was reading a fabulous article from Rebecca Solnit in The Guardian. I highly recommend to anyone. And she ends the article by sharing this little anecdote where she was once talking to Bill McKibben, and they were interrupted, and someone asked, it's like, oh, where can I make the most difference as an individual? And Bill McKibben replied, stop being an individual. And I think there is something about that. I find it quite remarkable that we have a sense of powerlessness, given that we have never had as many researchers funded and resourced to do research, to do the very thing that they are doing. If you think about the history of humanity, there has never been as big a share of people with dedicated time to do that activity. But individually, it feels overwhelming, and we feel alone and separate. And so I would start by doing that. And the second, I think Wesley's presentation reminded me of Timothy Snyder's sort of recent book on how to react to tyranny. And he says, do not obey in advance as the first move, right? There is a tendency for researchers to discipline their own thinking ahead of time in anticipation of a constraint that they haven't even bumped against yet. So I do feel that if we start by doing those two things and actually probing into what is possible and insisting on trying rather than assuming that we know what is impossible, we can go a long way.
Thank you. Jonas wants to continue.
Yes, I can continue. I can only agree what Jonas just said. Thank you. I would say that the question is not like what is like the best strategy. Is it inner, outer? Is it language? Is it what? It's not the one thing. I would say that building on what was just shared, but also I think what is important is that because there is not only one strategy, and we all are different in our capabilities, what we are good at, what kind of level of courage or visibility we are ready to take on ourselves, so we can all work through different kinds of. I think it's extremely important point that was made just about the disciplining already responding before. I think I see this a lot in the sustainability science community right now with the question like, what is the point of this work anymore while we are still doing it? And this is, of course, a bit dangerous question. So kind of keep maintaining, again, this like we need these alternative visions. Choose what works best for you. Is it really being active through advocacy and activism? Is it through teaching? Is it through writing? But there is always a way to speak out. And again, what also Jonas said was the community, we are not alone. Best is to connect with communities, others thinking and working alike to get this support and the validation as well that you are not alone, you are not crazy, and these alternative views and visions are still needed. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the first thing is to echo Jonas's point on self-censorship. I think that's the worst thing that we can do, both with our words, but more so with our scientific work. So, and part of that is both overt authoritarian sort of suppression, where we fear that sort of backlash, but also it's the silent one. And I think this is a lot more difficult to do at the individual level. The silent one, at least within Europe, is the funding agency. So they have calls and you often respond to the calls and not what the science sort of should be directing. And I think that's a sort of sense of censorship that at the individual level, the cost benefit, perhaps also in terms of agency. For people who are further in their careers, they have a little bit more latitude. And so I would break it down in terms of the action and agency to where people are in their careers. Somebody who is starting out to make these bold sort of stands is a lot more difficult because you don't have a job to effectively. So I think that would be where I start for now in terms of agency and action.
Thank you so much to the three of you for your replies. I see that we have a question in the chat by Nicole. Nicole, do you want to speak or do you want me to read your question? If you want to speak, you can speak now if you want. Okay. So I'm going to read the question. She said that. Okay. So question for the panel. Can you share any examples of narratives or stories that showcase researchers who have worked together for positive change or resistance? Whose voice can we help amplify or add to? Okay, sorry, I didn't see the end of the question that you were asking of not being called because you are in a place where you cannot turn on your mic. Okay, sorry for that. So what do you think of this question? Viola, Jonas, and Wesley.
Viola, yeah, sure.
I think I can share example of a strong example in my mind about the space where these narratives and connections are created, where I was happy to be part of when I was still working in Finland. So just to keep it short, but actively there is an initiative called House for Science and Hope that's funded by different foundations, and this space actively this initiative actively creates a space for researchers and practitioners to come together. And this is nothing new, right? But I believe how they do it in their principles and operation, like working operational principles, they talk about being chill, slowing down. And of course, this is a bit privileged perspective, but it's been what I observe very successful way of preaching and bringing people together and really making people who don't normally meet in a different way in different circumstances and creating those connections. So this is one example where I can directly say that they are contributing to positive change through this space of connections and again grounding the space in different kind of values that we are not maybe used to in the academic systems, that it is okay to work in a different way, not based on the competition, funding, scarcity, but what comes out when we come together. As one example, positive example. That also then motivates me when I'm not anymore part of physically there to kind of take these ideas further. And
Thank you. Jonas and Wesley, do you have examples to share?
Leave you muted.
You are mute. Okay. Not mute anymore, but we cannot hear you. Is there a problem with your mic? That's okay now. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I think I double clicked the audio thing without realizing that it's a double click. But Yeah, so I was going to say that part of what came to mind are two examples of resistance and sort of a reaction to this, and it's on networks. And so the Africa Charter on Transformative Research is one, which has now become it really mainly focuses on the Africa-Europe sort of research collaborations. And so the charter is one where institutions are signing up to have these pillars that sort of determine how they become partners. So an interesting one is capacity building, which is a term that you hear being thrown out every now and then. And it's firmly rejected in there because of the assumption that Europe has to capacitate Africa. And so that's one. And Claxo in Latin America comes in on the publication. So its resistance in the form of creating cooperatives and publication channels that don't rely on the ranking systems and the other sort of dominant formats. I think those are the two that sort of come to mind in terms of narratives or initiatives or networks that are going towards resistance.
Thank you.
I can share an experience of building networks. Earlier on in my career, I was part of a team at the University of Sussex where we hosted a kind of very small PhD seminar that was sort of happened every year. And out of that seminar, there was this recognition that there was something missing in the Sustainability Transition Research Network that I discussed, where early career researchers were basically not organized and there was no space for that. And it was a very interesting example of just feeling into the sense of like, this is something that we need, and the sharing of the longing across a community, and then seeing who responds. And out of that, someone responded that they could host something in Greenwich University, and someone named that they could contact a keynote and so forth. And we were able to organize a conference. And out of that, a network emerged. And this network is over 10 years now. And this has held annual conferences every year and has become a space of innovation within the Sustainability Transition Research Network, which that has also brought in a lot of the topics that were traditionally neglected by sort of more senior researchers. And this was all constructed with resources that could be found in the here and there, right? And I think a lot of the times there is this assumption that unless we have, hundreds of thousands of millions of euros, nothing can be done. And that is such a disempowering attitude, right? Instead of saying like, what can we do with the resources that we already have, and what should we do after that, and this sort of building a community in the process of doing it. I think there's a tendency to wait until funding provides the stamp of legitimacy that something is worth pursuing for then one person to start, instead of just starting and accepting that this might come later.
And if I can add, Bruno,
Yeah, sure.
What Jonas just talked about now is it also has to do with how our universities are structured. So when you speak to colleagues in the US, a lot of them don't have research projects, so they just go to work. And so a lot of their research is done on top of the teaching. So I think we can quite easily learn from each other based on sort of our different geographies on how we can do research for research's sake and not say we're waiting for funding. So it's figuring out how they're able to do it, still produce research and still sort of teach. And I think, one aspect that also then came to mind was it's all good and well to have communities and researchers or different stakeholders sort of work together in terms of the action, but there's the enforcement part. And the Yasuni case in Ecuador, the referendum in 2023 sort of exemplifies one of those instances where you do get a referendum where you stop drilling because majority of population has voted to stop drilling, which is a work between communities and researchers who play a very significant role in that. But as of 2026, we know that the government of Ecuador is not listening or not implementing that. So then it becomes the effort of, it doesn't stop at getting the first result, and then you have to then follow through, which I think is a lot more difficult for us scientists to talk about or figure out a solution, be it theoretically or practical.
Thank you for those examples. I would like to know if there are questions from the audience. If so, please raise your hand. Okay, Belen is asking if there will be a recording. Yes, there will be a recording available. And you want to add something on the situation in Ecuador? Belen?
I think they're confirming that they're one of the researchers who's dealt with the case.
Yeah. So interesting, yeah? Okay, I don't know if Belen is ready to talk. Maybe not.
Oh, hi. Yeah,
Oh,
sorry.
yes. Please go ahead.
I'm sorry. It's a little early here in Ecuador. No, thank you for the presentation. And I have been working with social ecological systems, but in Ecuador is really like a new topic. And although I have been mostly working with indigenous communities and co-creation of knowledge, I was just wondering if somebody in the audience is also working like in South America or are maybe open to collaborations here. Sorry, that is my dog. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So if anyone in the audience is working in Latin America on those topics, maybe you can put your name in the chat, or you can contact Belen Moya directly. Yes, and is there any other question from the audience? No, not yet. So yes, Viola.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there is no question from the audience, can I propose a question to the audience or anyone in this call?
Yes.
I just would love to hear if there are like other experiences to share, just not just from three of us, but I think we all highlighted this fact that we live and work in a very imperfect academic system that is embedded in, of course, in the greater geopolitical processes and tensions. And how to formulate this question. I just wonder if there are any experiences of thoughts around beyond three of us, how to keep developing the academic system towards more diverse, more just, equal system, while also maintaining that academic freedom that we already hopefully have to some degree, and not let it be eroded by then far-right agendas. So anyone who would like to share some experiences around this, because I think this is kind of the what Wesley was also talking about, the inner hijacking, and then together with the outer dynamics of the, of course, embedded and related systems. So just opening the space to hear from others, if this is okay for this webinar.
Oh, yes, it's really okay. Yeah. I would love to hear the comments from the audience about, yes, experiences of creating or maintaining a diverse and just and free academic system, but also a system committed to transformation. So please take a few minutes to think of your experience or examples you have heard of. It would be really interesting to hear different examples. Take some time. I mean, maybe when you try to look for an example or an experience to share, maybe I would like to ask another question to the speakers. But keep this in mind that we are interested in your experience. So please take the floor in a few minutes if you want. But in the meantime, I would like to ask a question about the interaction between sustainability scientists and educators with activism and advocacy groups. Especially, I mean, some scientists are engaged in activism or advocacy, others are interacting, like sharing information or different kinds of interactions. So I would like to know your opinion on the opportunities of this interaction, but also on the risks, especially as for us who teach students and young researchers to be transformative. It's difficult to address this question of activism or advocacy because students may be afraid of the political consequences of being labeled activists rather than scientists. So what do you think of this?
I can share some thoughts in how I approach this. With regards to the activism, I think sometimes there is a tendency to create a binary where either you're totally disengaged or you are yourself an activist, and there is no space in between for any other form of engagement. And I think that binary is not helpful, and it's actually I think everyone in every research project needs to ask themselves, in who do I stand in solidarity with? And that's a question that if you don't ask yourself, you might find yourself in solidarity with actors that are doing terrible things, right? And we all know of the amount of research that keeps on happening about, like, how to optimize fossil fuel drilling and things like that. If you're not asking that question, there is a problem. Well, we tend to not name that as sort of research that is engaged and that is involved, right? So I believe that we need to move towards a place where we can be explicit about what kinds of solidarity motivate the research, and this question of axiology, like what are the values that inform the choices that then go on to structure methods and choices. Too many times we talk about epistemology, but as if axiology did not exist. And then we find ourselves, having these proceduralist discussions about methods detached from value choices that inform everything. Every choice of a method is itself informed implicitly or explicitly by values. And the more we're able to do that explicitly and reflect on it, we could do that. And the second, I do think there is something about not conflating identities. I think these different identities, they afford different things. As a researcher, you're able to do certain things that you're not as an activist, and vice versa. And so to simply conflate those two also detracts us from benefiting from the particular affordances that these identities have. And there might be ways of inhabiting different identities in different spaces, but not becoming a blob where the academic and the activist stance is just undifferentiated. I would not think this is beneficial.
Thank you.
I can go and say, I suppose with students, it depends on the level. I think I was a lot more very advocacy and in your face as an undergrad. And in graduate school is when I started looking at these sort of tensions, primarily because I had also been told that you cannot have these normative views, or you cannot be an activist within sort of academia, because no one will listen to you. And so looking back now, I see that I don't know if I can ever completely stop being an activist, primarily because I also research things that I deeply care about. And so often it is very difficult to draw the line myself. And this is before I even start looking at students. And so leaving myself to the side with students, I think the opportunity, as you asked, Bruno, is precisely that tension. I think that's the opportunity. I think students who feel that pressure are already doing the analytical work. I think they are already reading the boundary between scientist and activist, and they're asking, who draws it and why. And in sustainability science, that's the main question, I think. I think also the risk then for us as educators is that we try and resolve this tension too quickly. Either we try and tell students that they should stay safely within scientific norms, or we romanticize activism without sort of preparing them for the institutional consequences of those actions. And then, of course, any of these two responses will leave students very exposed. And so what I'm trying to do, and I've certainly not mastered the art, is to connect to Viola's work on inner transformation and help students to name the mechanism. Because I think once they can see that the scientist/activist distinction is itself a gatekeeping device, they will be able to see that it protects the institution from inconvenient knowledge. And then they'll be able to make a conscious choice themselves about how to position themselves, instead of just being absorbed by this fear. So I think those are sort of my 2 cents on this one.
Thank you.
I can also share my take on this because it is a topic that when you teach a lot, of course, you encounter this question, and it's an important question. And how I approach is to just say that you can be an activist and a researcher at the same time. I mean, I don't see there is a problem with combining with these two roles. And again, if we take the action-oriented commitment of sustainability science seriously, we are ultimately talking about action. Of course, you don't need to label yourself as an activist or be an activist to be a sustainability science. So it's not like complete overlap, but there is the thing that I try to teach and talk to the students is this like, yes, transformative change, but while doing the critical reflection, a critical thinking, like where are we going, who is included, who is excluded, how do you move forward, but with intention. Because if we don't have this critical thinking, we just can, strengthen existing hegemonies, power dynamics, not challenge, not resist, but kind of trying to somehow together reach the sweet spot of reflection, action. And then, of course, the identity, the role you take from there depends on you as a person. And I must say that the students I get to work with at Toifana are often really active and really critical and amazing. So actually it's this really good exchange with them. So my approach to this question is that you don't need to choose. You can be both.
Thank you very much to the three of you. Now back to the audience. Does anyone want to share a story, an experience on sustainability science or teaching? So no, I don't see any hands. So please continue looking for an example to share if you can, and raise your hand if you want. Again, I would like to ask a question to the speakers. This time, it's not about activism or advocacy. It's on the interaction with art. So the art-science interaction. So how do you see the opportunities of using those interactions to help sustainability research and education to adapt to or to transform within those political current contexts? I was interested in, I read a paper co-written by Jonas 2 years ago in Ecology and Society, on 9 dimensions for evaluating how art and creative practice stimulate societal transformation. Very interesting. And I think, I mean, the 3 speakers have something to say about art and science interaction. So how do you see the potential of those interactions? To start.
Maybe Jonas can go first, since you've written on this extensively.
Yeah, I wouldn't say extensively, but yeah, so the paper that you're referring to is an output from a really interesting European project that I wasn't directly involved with, but I was brought in to participate in this one paper named Creatures. And what Creatures did was to study a whole range of creative practices that were spanning that boundary. And the paper is trying to name, if you want, these sort of different dimensions of the kind of contributions that are there. So, for instance, you can imagine art being very helpful in embodying and sensitizing us to a whole range of experiences that are connected to science. I'm currently involved in the follow-up to the Impossible projects with NVO in a project called Kennis and Transitie, so knowledge in transition. And there we are exploring the role of artistic research itself. So one of the things that I think it's important that we start considering is not only this sort of instrumental enrollment of art in a kind of communication role that is supporting scientists' sort of outputs, but much more in these sort of joint processes or even artist-led processes of research that have a completely different set of potentialities. And for anyone interested, we are currently, we set out a call for interest for anyone working in this space in the Netherlands. And we're starting a process of thinking what modes of funding might be supportive of artistic research for that. So following a similar logic from Impossible Projects to do that with artistic research. And I would say that for me in particular, the role is that we cannot research something that we are desensitized towards, right? Like if we're losing our sense of what matters and what is significant, we're not going to be good researchers. And if art can do something to re-aliven our connection to the issues that we're in, that goes a long way.
Thank you. By the way, I've shared the link
Thank you.
to the Creature Framework website and also the reference of the paper.
Excellent. Thank you.
You're welcome. Viola and Wesley, do you want to add something on art and science interactions?
Wesley, do you want to go or do I? Yeah, okay. Thanks. I can again add more from the pedagogical perspective. So I got into the very when I was doing a postdoc in sustainability education, I was getting into these embodied ways of learning, teaching, and kind of as one type of arts-based method. And yes, so this kind of a neglected dimension of imagination, body embodiment, and the relational consequences from such exercises as forum plays or role plays or different kinds of walking, statue exercises. So for me, when I started to explore with this as a sustainability scientist, it did open a new door also to my own like thinking and feeling about sustainability and also how do you then relate to others. And then I have been taking this to my teaching recently, and I can only recommend such approaches. I would put the disclaimer first. Often when you bring in something more crazy, and maybe others can relate here, crazy more, no less crazy in I mean like less conventional ways, you can feel a bit stupid yourself when you start to bring in exercises that are more embodied. But I think once you get over with that, it's usually very giving and good. And I just wanted to highlight one when we talk about transformative changes in the transformations. Education, I've been using now with bachelor's and master's students in sustainability studies, basically a method which is really easy to implement in even a big lecture classroom with over 100 people, something that connects future visioning first. So how would world look like in 50 or 100 years when there is no sustainability crisis? What would you be doing? How does it smell? How does it feel? And after doing this little imaginary journey, then the students will interview each other. So one person is from the future and one person is from the current times, and trying to understand how does it look like there, and then how did we get there as a humanity. And there, this exercise really highlights first the diversity of use, what is the sustainable future, but also enables the space to imagine this world where we don't have this constant pressure. And then hearing from others, and of course training interview skills and all kinds of skills, and then demonstrating visioning exercises. So it has a really multi-purpose. But I really recommend, and after this exercise, students have come to say to me that this was a transformative exercise. I don't know what they mean by transformative, but something was triggered inside when you are allowed to imagine something that's kind of we are working towards, but we very rarely let ourselves to think like, what is the sustainable future for me, and how does it differ or is similar to others? So highly recommend. Yes.
Yeah, I fully agree with you that artistic activities are really powerful to open imagination and create new narratives. And I had the same feedback from participants in art science schools or workshops, where people always say that it was really a transformative experience. So I agree with you, yeah. Back to the audience. No one wants to... Colin, yes, Colin. Colin said that my question was too big.
I'm sorry.
Questions are too big, yeah. So
Yeah,
Colin.
it was a very big question, and I'm not going to answer. I actually just have a follow-up question to the question that Bruno just asked on the interactions between arts and science. And Viola, you started responding to it a little bit, but I was wondering if we could maybe go a little bit deeper into it on how what pathways sort of exist in terms of or that you've seen in terms of education and in terms of education and training, basically, on how you can foster collaborative action, especially in a world that is just mainly, I mean, still extremely individualistic. And I'm thinking about it maybe also with younger publics who are globally still in a system, in a school system, let's say, that is very focused on their own achievements and on their own learning and their own pathways. Like, how can you, use maybe some of these like arts and science perspectives or different types of learning methods that really encourage collaborative action, which is one of the main pillars of transformations and socio-ecological transformations. So yeah, I directed my question to Viola, but of course, Jonas and Wesley, if you have answers, I'd be glad to hear them.
I just noticed that Wesley didn't get to comment the previous question also, but and now maybe I start to respond anyways a little bit to the question posed. But I was smiling when you were asking the question, because I got a similar question from a student of mine, a bachelor student, a year ago. When after this kind of talking about visions and visioning and doing this exercise, I was like, yeah, but like, how about when we work in society? And he framed the question in this way, especially in the German culture where things are usually really rigid. So how do we bring these kinds of methods? So can we use this like outside? And I was completely surprised by this question. I was new to Germany, and I was like, yeah, I mean, it's not only a German context. I think overall, like, how do we engage with arts more broadly, and how do we use them? But I still was like, well, you are exactly the people who can be then changing these structures and bringing these new ideas to this, what he described as very rigid structures. And now I forgot already the question, of course, when I started to share this anecdote. I'm sorry. No, yeah. Maybe Jonas and Wesley, you can jump in here. Well, I lost myself.
Yeah, I can.
Sorry,
I can
Wesley,
try.
for not giving you the floor before.
Say again.
No, sorry that you were not able to reply to the previous question. Sorry for that.
Oh no, not a problem at all. So maybe I'll start with your question, Bruno, and then I can attempt Colin's question as well. I think Jonas's framing that we cannot research what we're desensitized to connects directly to something, sort of the whole systemic hijacking work that I'm currently busy with, sort of, because I think systemic hijacking works partly through desensitization. I think institutions that sort of repeat the language of transformation, if you do it often enough, even as us individuals, I think then it loses its charge. And art then disrupts that, and it interrupts that. I think it then resensitizes us to what these concepts actually mean in lived experiences. And that's the part that is very difficult for individuals and institutions to then absorb and perhaps metabolize. And I've been trying to collect my thoughts so that I can be coherent here, but we had an art component to our Habitable Air project almost organically, in terms of we were working with some colleagues in anthropology who gave air monitors to community members. And part of what we couldn't ever have figured out was how, when somebody blow dries their hair, how the monitor beeps out of control, as if they're living right next door to a plastic manufacturing company, right? And part of this was then captured through a documentary. But at the same time, these are fence-line communities. So on the one hand, you have a documentary where people are saying, I've lost 4 daughters, and this is somebody who is in Louisiana in the US through the same type of cancer. And you have somebody in Sasolburg in South Africa who is saying, I wake up every morning and I smell blood. So it's not something that I think we could have captured as scientists and put out there in an academic publication. And so we took this art and we, together with photographs, and so now we had about 5 sort of documentaries from 5 different projects, ours included, and we showcased this first at a scientific conference, and then second at the UN. And the reactions to this with both policymakers at these high levels and the scientific communities also brought it to bear, how the lived experiences resensitize, I think, sort of us and others. But it also then means that, and you can't put a KPI on it, on art, right? Unlike with science, you have boxes that you have to tick if you're ever going to be published. But with art, it's freeing and there's freedom in it, which is why I think art is more threatening in authoritarian sort of settings, because that is the first one to be targeted. I think scientists and academic publications are targeted last. What they first target typically is art, because it is that dangerous. And I recently wrote a review for a book called Decolonizing Europe. And I think it must have been the chapter on Portugal, where they had these art projects. It was Portugal and Italy, I think, where they used these high school going students in art projects to sort of show their lived experiences. And again, that sort of artwork also brings a different kind of sensitivity to the everyday system. So I think it for me, I think that's one of the things, I think, between art and science that, where we can say there's a collaboration there, and that book chapter perhaps has the pathways in education that forced a sort of collaborative action because it forced even students who are on their phones all the time to work together on a particular thing.
Thank you. Jonas, do you want to add something?
Sure. At the moment, I'm lucky to teach 2 courses that have a lot of space for exactly the kind of work that Colleen is mentioning. One is called Imagining the Future for Transformations. And this is a course I teach with Josie Chambers, who's a dear colleague. And that course is special in the sense that not only we use art throughout as part of the material, in terms of both connecting to scientific depictions of the like artistic depictions of the future, film, music, things that are constantly used, constantly bombarding us in a sense with particular imaginaries of the future. But we also use poetry and ways of engaging with students that really land the material, right? It's so easy to read papers upon papers and never quite get it. And sometimes a poem can kind of distill a very complex idea in an extremely powerful way. For instance, a poem that we have used recently or brought into the class is a piece by Bayo Komolafe on this idea of cracks and doors. And it's also a poem that went on to inspire my most recent paper with colleagues, with Dalia and Timo, who was in the call. And this is an example of a poem that just lands an incredibly complex idea and delivers it so majestically. So I do feel that there is an appetite for that. It's perhaps an untapped sort of appetite in the sense that many students don't even consider this to be a possibility. And so at first there is an awkwardness, like Viola mentioned. And then to use art, to use the production of art itself as something that is also a highly valuable output of work. So, for instance, in Imagining the Future for Transformations, students actually co-create an exhibition as the final assignment to the course, in which they are creating experiences that discuss, particular ways into the future. And this has been just a most rewarding experience for everyone involved, where they go above and beyond what they would have gone for a traditional assignment. And every year the students self-produce a zine that collates all the outcomes of that. So even at that level, the producing of art together is creating the kind of relationality that we need, where students find themselves having to grapple with these deeper questions and really finding new ways to articulate how they understand and feel about certain issues.
Thank you. So a final call to the audience for comments or sharing experience or questions as well. And I'm also extending the invitation. Stefan, please.
Hi, hi everyone. Hi Bruno, Viola, the ones I know and the others. So sorry, there's a lot of noise. I don't know if you hear the noise. I hope not. Okay, I've been intermittently present in the event because there are many things happening in my house today. But I really connected with most of the ideas I've heard, so I really wanted to thank all the speakers and the organizers. It's a very important type of discussion that I think is increasingly needed. And it reminded me of, so I'm from Colombia, but I'm currently based in France, seeing how French politics and academic sustainability backlash, etc., reminds me of what happened in my country, what happens in my country periodically. It's it's a cyclical thing that happens every time the far right gains power in Colombia. These backlashes happen. Not only in academia, but in social movements, social territorial movements. And one of the things that these movements do to survive these dark periods is to, of course, connect and also retreat a little bit, get into intimate spaces, safe spaces, get less public, etc. But also find sources of funding, alternative, because without money, it's very hard to keep doing all these things, which is why I really like Wesley's call for not forgetting the materialities of all these fights. It's not only discursive. And, but from the perspective of Colombia, the alternative funding was NGOs, European-based funding, or paradoxically, USAID, for example, which, so the funding sometimes comes from institutions that are part of the wider system that promotes the backlash. So I don't know if there's time for a question, but or short answers, but this is the question from Europe and in Europe. Is there an alternative to find funding? Like I see we are in the dilemma of the public funding is decreasing. The alternative sources of funding seem to be private institutions, like in the US, foundations that are sometimes linked to big enterprises, big capital, but I don't see any alternative. So do you see the same dilemma? Do you know of alternatives or other strategies? Thank you.
I can reply quickly. Bruno, I think you're muted, but I don't know if you want to say something before.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. No, I was saying thank you, Stefan, and who wants to comment on it or reply? Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. Thank you, Stefan. It's really a fascinating question, and I see the dilemma there. I'm currently sort of very interested in questions around this idea of alternative mass mobilization. So what are processes by which large-scale prefigurative movements can come together and really create the conditions by which transformations are possible? And one thing I find it interesting is that in that prefigurative dimension is the ways in which the very way you're funding your movement is already gesturing towards particular futures and particular power relations and so forth. So I think that kind of prefigurative reflection about what forms of relational, like what forms of relation dependence and so forth are we willing to live with or not, it's really central to how movements organize themselves. And I think we often don't talk about the costs of funding, be it the overwhelm on activists trying to apply for projects and the kind of projectified structures that then they are bound by and all the evaluative sort of restrictions that they find themselves to. And I wish there was much more support for sort of reimagining that as an organic part of these processes and movements, and to perhaps start with more local and organic and perhaps not as abundant sources of funding, but nevertheless that already create the kind of relational basis on which the movement can grow. I think the tendency to want to kind of tap into larger pots of funding then creates a whole organization that is geared towards that, as opposed to geared towards connecting with the communities you're serving and so forth. So there is a space for that, and of course, in situations where there's a genuine scarcity, that is much harder to do. But I feel that even within that scarcity, sometimes there is a benefit to organizing in that way, with meager resources, but in ways that are well resourced, if that makes sense.
Wesley or Viola, do you want to add something?
Not directly about funding, but the concept of backlash, I think it's a really interesting concept, and I think many people are looking into it right now. Just thinking that it's if you take it in a descriptive way, so you take the regressive connotation away, it it can also, like, backlash can happen to either direction, right? What's more progressive or regressive policies. And I think it just provides us an avenue to also understand these deeply transformative dynamics. And here, without any pre-notion where the transformation is unfolding, in a sense. So kind of just adding this lens as an interesting analytical lens to, like, yeah, so like in many ways, just to say this. Yeah. And nice to see you, Stefan.
I don't have a very coherent one to that. I've been trying to think about it, but I can think about this sort of what I wish we could do, and it is cooperatives. The idea of people with a common interest coming together and co-funding what needs to be funded. And then I can think about it because many of the research projects, at least at my university and in my department right now, come with discretion. So there's a big chunk of discretion that, you know, PIs have. And it's from that part, I think, where you can start off with the idea of a cooperative. But again, it's not a well thought out idea and perhaps even naive and idealistic, but that's sort of what keeps ringing in my head at this moment.
Thank you. So as we draw this session to a close, I would like to extend a big thank you to our three speakers, Viola, Wesley, and Jonas, not only for presenting their research to us today, but also for their engagement and their contribution to transformative sustainability science. So today we have explored how our research and teaching practices can remain engaged, critical, and accessible. And if there is one takeaway from the discussion, it's that while the rise of anti-science movement and political pressures aim to silence critical inquiry, the community that we have seen today proves that transformation is still possible through many ways. So thank you to the audience as well for being part of this exchange. And we hope that this conversation serves as a catalyst for your own work, whether in the lab, in the classroom, or in the field. I'm now giving back the floor to Viola Baldeschi for a few concluding words. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Bruno, for moderating this discussion, and thanks to our speaker for these very interesting presentations and for all the wonderful insights of today's webinar. So if you've enjoyed the topic of today's discussion and you would like to go further, we have prepared a reading list for you to explore and read in your own time. My colleague Rosie just shared that in the chat. And I also just wanted to make a small announcement. We are currently organizing a conference titled Towards a Just and Habitable World, exploring the role of technology, together with the University of Lausanne and the Center for Earth Politics. It's going to be taking place in Lausanne this June. And in the context of this conference, we are also organizing an opening forum on the 2nd of June to kickstart the conference. And it's directly related to all of the things we've been discussing about today. And the title of this opening forum is Research and Higher Education for Just Transformations and Turbulent Times. And I believe it could be interesting for some of you to perhaps attend that if you have availability and time. We can share more information with you by email when we will share the recording of this forum as well. And if you would like to stay informed and not miss any updates, you can subscribe to our newsletter and follow us on LinkedIn. And also browse on our deep dive webpage. There are plenty of resources to learn more about the connections between the ecological crisis and the socio and geopolitical tensions that we're witnessing today. Well, with this, I would like to thank everyone for joining us today, and again, the speakers and Bruno for the discussion. So, well, thank you very much. And I hope we can stay in touch.
Thank you so much.